You've probably heard the term 1.5 degrees in relation to climate change. It is thrown around a lot, but it's often not explained in depth. My goal is to explain what it means, why it's important, and how this goal is looking so far. So, here's the history. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning fossil fuels, which releases greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. These gases then keep heat from escaping Earth's atmosphere, trapping it near the surface of the planet, thus warming the planet up. This is called the greenhouse effect, and it is what is making our planet heat up. The average annual global temperature of the planet has risen 1.2 degrees Celsius since before the Industrial Revolution. This doesn't sound like a lot, but it's really bad. All of the heat waves, floods, fires, and other catastrophic symptoms of climate change that we already experience are at only 1.2 degrees of warming. 1.5 degrees, just 0.3 degrees more than temperatures have already risen, is the commonly cited limit that we should try not to let warming pass, as it was the lowest amount of temperature rise that we could feasibly achieve. 1.5 degrees was not always the limit we set. 2 degrees of warming was a common target until the Paris Climate Accords of 2015 made the switch to 1.5. Additionally, at the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2019, there was a big push among delegations from African nations to limit temperatures to 1 degree of warming. Every fraction of a degree of warming makes climate change a lot worse, which is why scientists have focused on 1.5 degrees for the last few years. You may be asking, what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming? How much of a difference can half a degree make? Well, the short answer is a lot. To give an example, at 1.5 degrees of warming, 70 to 90% of coral reefs will die off worldwide, and at 2 degrees of warming, 99% will die off. At 1.5 degrees, massive heat waves that used to happen once every 50 years will happen around 8.5 times every 50 years, and at 2 degrees, they could happen 14 times every 50 years. At 2 degrees of warming, sea levels could get twice as high as they could with 1.5 degrees of warming. Another dangerous difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming is the potential tipping points. For example, at a certain temperature, the Greenland ice sheet will melt enough that it is unable to stop from completely melting. This would raise global sea levels by around 23 feet or 7 meters. It could also warm the planet more, since the white ice currently reflects heat back into the atmosphere. And the large increase of freshwater in one part of the ocean from all this melting could slow global ocean currents. We don't know at exactly what temperature this will happen, but the closer we get to 2 degrees of warming, the more likely it will occur. Clearly, half a degree of warming makes a world of difference. And remember, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees still has disastrous implications. Even at 1.2 degrees of warming, where we currently are, heat waves, droughts, fires, floods, and massive winter storms ravage the world annually. Climate change is here, and it's only getting worse, but it's up to us to decide how bad we want it to get. So, how do we stay below 1.5 degrees of warming? Before we answer that question, some clarification is necessary. In all the reporting on climate change this year, you may have seen it announced that we will pass 1.5 degrees this year. And yes, this year global temperatures will likely exceed 1.5 degrees of warming. But this is not entirely due to climate change. This is also an El Niño year, which is a natural weather event that occurs every few years and makes the globe hotter. For example, the hottest year in modern history is 2016. Even though global warming has gotten much worse since then, that year was the last time we had a massive El Niño event like the one we're seeing this year. This means that even if we pass 1.5 degrees of warming this year, the multi-year average may still be below 1.5 degrees. Anyway, back to the previous question. How do we stay below 1.5 degrees of warming? The short answer is, we can't. 2 years ago, the International Energy Agency, which is a global policy organization that typically holds back from making big claims like this, stated that there can be no new oil, gas, or coal development if the world is to reach net zero by 2050, and that there can be no new investments in fossil fuels if we are to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, a UN-assembled group of climate scientists that reports on climate change, heeded similar warnings that year. Sadly, both of these have happened as we have increased investments in and development of fossil fuels. And last year, the UN announced that there is no credible pathway to the 1.5 degree limit. Does that mean all hope is lost? No, of course not. As we've seen, every fraction of a degree matters. 1.6 degrees of warming is better than 1.7 degrees, which is better than 1.8. We need to work as quickly as possible to stop climate change and ensure our planet remains livable. We need to pressure our governments to transition away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy and green economies. We also need to focus on nature rehabilitation, which will lessen the impacts of the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. The best way for you to do something about this is to use your voice. Find a local group to volunteer for, write to your legislators in support of climate action, and vote for eco-conscious candidates. You can also try to bring more people into the movement, find ways of reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, and continue learning about climate change. While we won't stay below 1.5 degrees of warming, it still needs to be our target so we can remain as close as possible. Action and progress will keep our planet much more livable than it would have otherwise been.